This week's episode was brought to you by DreamingJonah.com. If you too would like to support the show, make your way on over to www.patreon.com/thewholerabbit, where itsy bitsy teensy weensy $5 a month will get you not just our full extended shows, but access to our Discord server, free stickers, and some high-resolution artwork that we made that you can't get anywhere else. It's kind of a deal and a bit of a steal. Are you stuck inside the belly of the beast? Stressed? Depressed? Well, don't be. You can have fun inside. DreamingJonah.com has a selection of high-quality enamel pins sure to make that punk kid you have a crush on jealous and want to look right at you. Well, at least at your pins. After all, they're cute AF. Collect all 4. And be sure to use the promotion code WHOLERABBIT. That's one word, no spaces. It'll get you 10% off the entire order. That's whole with a W. I hope you figured that out by now. Head on over to www.dreamingjonah.com. That's Jonah spelled like Jona. And that's it. DreamingJonah.com. Promotion code WHOLERABBIT. Support my coworker/roommate who's making these amazing sparkly pins. They're wayly cool. They're sure to impress. Thank you and enjoy the show. No, you're fine. So fine, girl. So fine. I don't know who that was. That was a comedian back in the days of yore. Back in my formative years as a child babe, my mind is so open, like a garbage disposal.
Like an open book.
My
garbage disposal is broken.
Is it? You just have to stick a bunch of knives in there and just be like until it's all chopped up.
I got a special wrench for it.
You'd have to have something special for it. You can't just have no sink. You have to have tubes. Everything, if you think about it, is a series of tubes. Probably including what we're talking about today.
Which is...
Well, we can't just do it that way.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Whole Rabbit, where we don't just investigate the tiny little minds of children from the ages of 3 to 12 and then get bored of them because we have strange proclivities other than psychology. No, we crack open the book of the subconscious mind, delving into it like Jennifer Lopez from The Cell, and put on our goggles of the unblinding truth of unfiltered reality to reveal the spectacle and illusion that is the ego. Hello, everybody. I'm your host, Luke Madrid. I'm joined by Mari-san. Herself. Sorry. You can say hi again if you want.
I
and I. I've heard stoners say that a lot, the I and I thing. So that means you're high. If you say I am. That's like when you hold a handheld mirror up to like the big mirror in the bathroom and you pull a Star Wars Infinite Mirrors. So I had a great week. I got to participate in what they call the largest eviction in history. That sounds a bit dramatic.
It's a bummer.
It's a bummer, but I was in it. I participated. It's like the Bull Run in Spain, but with less cheering. In fact, everyone's booing, but quietly over social media to each other in Messenger.
And the bull is an old cat lady.
Yeah. I don't know what that means, but I agree. My ego is so bruised, and it was so bruised. I was like, here I am just licking my ego. What's the show? Oh, the ego. I think most of what we understand from the ego is gleaned from Sigmund Freud. I mean, Sigmund Freud has sort of framed everything we know about psychology and all the stereotypes associated with it. Like just the whole laying down on the couch, and we're going to talk about your dreams. The whole stereotype of psychology begins with Freud.
Well, he's the father of modern psychology as we know it, or psychoanalysis even.
But we don't like in class, you'll kind of talk about his theories and be like, he was gross though.
and then just kind of glean over
Right,
it.
but you have to examine his theory, though. Like the teacher always is like, well, we know it's gross, but it's important still. And I'm like, okay. But it's like one of the only theories that they teach you in school. You're right.
I mean, it's one of the first ones they'll show you, but as they show it to you, they're like, yeah, it's kind of gross.
The instructors don't know what to say in response, really.
Yeah, because it's weird. They're like, oh, it's irrelevant, it's old, but we kind of have to learn about it because everyone references it, or because like it's almost like we have to talk about it, but we don't want to acknowledge its relevance. And then the further I got into class, we didn't even mention Jung. It never came up. Jung, CG Jung.
No, that's a side thing, and a lot of times you'll find it either in if you take literature classes. Sometimes you'll read him, but other than that, the scientific side of psychology kind of like pushes him out. He's a little outside the scope of modern psychology.
And I think the big contentious reason for why they don't like him that I've heard, it boils down to the idea they disagree that everything is sex, and Freud thinks everything is sex, and not everyone else does, including CG Jung.
Right, and he was actually a student of Sigmund Freud for a while.
In his Red Book, it shows mandalas of his wise role models and teachers, books he had read. But, excuse me, whenever he represents a teacher, it's Sigmund Freud. Like, it's the image of his angel, of his master teacher, of his old man. There's a technical term for that. We found it in the research.
Yes. The Jungian term for it would be basically your higher self, which in a man would be a wise old man archetype. But in a woman, it would be a mother or a crone.
Ah, yes, crone. Or Senex. That's the name for the old man one, Senex.
Did I upset you?
No, there's a loud helicopter outside. And speaking of loud helicopters, you know what a Senex reminds me of a little bit? Is Bruce Willis in Looper, because he's like the older version in time of the younger protagonist, and so he knows everything that the protagonist is gonna do, but he's like older and wiser, and he like connects the younger protagonist to himself later in time. He's like the ultimate action Senex. Okay, I know I'm crazy. Okay, so Sigmund Freud, just to break it down, he's the one that introduced the psychodynamic perspective of personality, which breaks it down into 3 component parts, which make it pretty easy to understand. You got the id, which is like the ID in ID software. Then you got the ego, which is kind of like the ego. And then you got the
Lego my ego.
Right, and then you have the super ego. And that's it, right? You got the 3. And if you break it down basically, the id is like, I want to do that right now. The superego is like, well, I don't know if it would be appropriate to do that. I don't know if that'd be rational or good to do that. And then the ego,
it's the scolding mechanism,
like the parenting or the higher self part.
Right.
And then the ego has to negotiate between the id and the superego. And it's like, well, how do we come to a compromise and work this out between all of us?
Right. And the ego often ends up making excuses.
So is that to say you could have a relationship, your ego could have a relationship with the other 2 that's bad, and your ego could have a relationship with both that's good, or have one that's good and one that's bad, or like it leans one way or the other too much?
Right. Then that would create like a personality quirk, I guess you'd call it. Because if you want instant gratification, it's pretty easy for an ego to justify many reasons, like a whole list of reasons why it would be beneficial to do those things, even though they're probably not a good idea. There's a way to go overboard. And then you ever had somebody who's super self-critical and you don't understand, how they could view themselves as imperfect because they're the most perfect person you know? There's a lot of people like that too, where their super ego is probably out of control.
Absolutely. I feel like I've had an imbalance of both of these things when I lost my mind for a little while. Like, I honestly probably over-identify with what I would see here as my superego. So the superego is concerned with social rules, morals, similar to what people call their conscience, their moral compass, and it develops as a child learns their culture. It pertains to right and wrong. So if you're super ego, so if you really want to have a drink, but you're not having one because you're trying to be responsible, it's because your super ego is telling you, no, you shouldn't have a drink because you have to drive home later. Or you should wear a condom, even though it would feel better to not to, because it'll prevent STDs and it'll prevent pregnancy. So that's your super ego that stops you. But it's your id that says, I want a drink, so I'm going to have it right now. I don't want to wear a condom. It doesn't feel good. I don't care what happens later because this feels great right now.
Right. So your full ego has to make the decision of where to compromise.
So your ego's like, well, let's put the condom on in a sexy way. Or like, let's just have a White Claw. That's what I've heard people tell me to do.
Oh, no.
You're just, oh, no. There's no follow-up to that.
It's just fucking malt liquor, gross.
I don't know why my mind's in the gutter all the time.
Well, probably because you've been reading Freud.
No, burn. He's not as, like, honestly, the one that creeped me out, I think, was Piaget. Like,
what? I didn't look into that.
Like, how come these people, like, I'm pretty sure it was Piaget who's like, yeah, once you turn 13, I don't give a anymore. You know, like there's a number of psychologists that were like that, and they help develop these different stages of development. So so you mentioned personality disorders, and Freud has very specific guidelines to how that works. It's called the psychosexual stages of development. And each of the stages is associated with like particular battle that happens in the psyche and must be resolved in the individual before he can move on or she can move on to the next stage. And the resolution of these conflicts require sexual energy. A certain amount is expended at each stage, and it works like military troops on the march. As the troops advance, the more troops that are needed to win a certain battle, the army gets weaker as it moves on to the next battle. And depending on how much energy is needed in that one, depends on how much energy gets used in the next battle, and so on and so forth. You can basically run into hitches and run out of energy and get weaker and develop personality disorders as it goes on. And he breaks down the stages. It goes by age, and it is associated with a different type of sexual stimulation. What the F? So these different stages, these different conflicts. The first one is the oral stage, and it happens from birth to 1 year old. It's associated oral with the mouth, and it includes sucking, swallowing, eating your best friend.
Crying.
Is it crying?
Yeah.
Really? That's cool. I didn't know that. People that want to smoke cigarettes or like eat their little furry friends, that's like a oral thing, you could say. Right. Vor.
Oh, hello.
I don't know, man. But if you really want to watch the fox from Zootopia eat the bunny, that's like an oral thing, right?
That's gross. How about the wolf and the bunny from Beastars?
I don't know what Beastars is, but I know some people like it. I know there's
choice furry anime. Weep trash. Anyway, it has vor in it, and very, very oral fixation on this thing.
Well, the first time I got stoned, I watched Pulp Fiction, and I realized that they're pretty much eating or drinking or consuming something in almost every scene. Like they always have a drink in their hand, or they're snorting cocaine, or they're eating food, or they're talking about food. It's just constantly with the putting something in there, like consuming it.
Well, what's next?
Anal.
Butt stuff.
I was coming back from Burning Man one year, and we were all talking about sex stuff, and there was one or two girls in the car, right? Women, whatever you want to call them. I don't know.
Whammons.
They wouldn't mind if I called them whatever. I just called them.
Lady types.
Lady, whatever, right? But it's mainly like the guys talking. And I was talking about how I don't really like butt stuff. And the wise one in the car, he's now no longer with us, but he was the wisest of us. The Spellman, we'll call him. Anyone who's listening knows the Spellman.
Spellman.
Yeah. He says, yeah, you got it. He says, you know, Luke, it's not gay if you like butt stuff. And I'm like, dude, or if it's not gay if you do butt stuff with your girlfriend, Luke. I think that's really what he said. And I'm like,
It's not.
it's not wrong. I don't think it's wrong to be gay. I just don't like butt stuff.
Butt stuff is the best.
And yeah, some people feel very strongly about butt stuff. I mean, like if I was
a shame.
you know, but some people. So that stage, the anal stage, occurs from 1 to 3 years old, and that is associated with withholding poo-poo or letting out the poo-poo, basically.
Even pee too, and then it also has to do with emotional explosions. So like tantrums. So like learning how to withhold like the need to get someone's attention when they're busy with something instead of having a tantrum, following the rules regardless of what the child wants to do. So that's also has to do with the anal retentive stage. So when you hear someone say, oh, so-and-so is anal retentive, something probably happened to them at this stage. So they try to control the environment around them. So that's what that term means.
Yeah, and I've had this is one of those things where the colloquial and the mainstream understanding I feel is somewhat accurate, and people are always trying to like jump down people's throats. You don't even know what that means. So it's like, well, I don't know. We all kind of know what it means. It's like it means you're controlling
things in your anus.
You're a controlling asshole.
You're uptight.
Yeah.
You're high strung. You need to chill the out and smoke a doob.
Yeah. Which is back to the oral stage. We'll get back to that. The next stage. We'll get back.
No, it's not. It's you know what it is. It's the phallic stage.
If you say so, because let's get
cigars.
Because that's the next stage. That's 3 to 6 years, and it's the penis or the clitoris, and also erogenous zones.
Oh.
See, ever since I was a really little kid, thankfully I've never had anyone forcefully touch them. I've never like stood next to Joe Biden, but I've never really appreciated anything touching my nipples. I just don't like it. Ugh. Get like a weird skin crawly feeling, you know?
It's what the ASMR people talk.
Do they talk about that?
Yeah, the little tinglies. Call them tingles.
I don't even know if I'd call them tingles. They don't feel like tingles. It just feels like a sense of overwhelming like dread or something, man.
Oh Lord. I don't know about this. Like, I mean, kids tend to experiment and stuff at this stage, and then they have to learn the differences between male and female and such because they're going to school.
I personally don't understand this stage at all. What he's talking about here, the phallic. I don't.
I know some theories, but I don't really agree with them. But yeah.
I kind of understand the oral and anal and agree to some extent. But when I get to the phallic here, and then to the next stage is latent, which is 6 years to puberty, where he says the libido's inactive. And then that's where my brain turns off because I'm just like, yeah, no.
I feel like these are reversed, in my opinion.
Yes. Because
you experience like your sexual, like you're like, ooh, what's sex? What's all that crap on TV? When you're like 7, like when you're like 6, 7, you're like starting to get older and you're almost like to a tween age. It's like, that's when you start to get curious and like, dude, you're 6 years old. You're like, you're stoked for your birthday because you like chocolate cake.
Right. I agree with you.
But you do have to learn the difference between boys and girls, what's appropriate, what's a bad touch, So I understand, like, in some respects, why it's called the phallic stage, because it is like the child is learning about sexual roles and what it means to be male and female.
Okay, yeah, like role modeling and all that. Okay.
And the physical part of it as well. Because they have to go to school. They have to know why they can't go to the bathroom with daddy anymore, like stuff like that. Or
and how
vice versa.
And like kids will play with dollies like pretty early. Like that whole parenting instinct thing turns on pretty quick.
Oh yeah.
Way before.
I mean, I never had that. Fuck dolls. I had trucks, but yeah.
I kind of had it all. I really liked guns and swords and stuff, but I still had like those I had like 1 or 2 trolls or whatever.
I had those from my sister though, but like I got Legos. That was my jam. And Connects.
Oh, I had Connects. I had Tinker Toys.
Oh, I love those.
Like the old school ones.
Yeah.
So then there's the genital stage, which is puberty to death, which is then maturing sexual instincts. This is where that thing where psychologists are like, and once the children of such an age, I don't care. You know what I mean? It's like, all right, great.
Yeah, like you're set in your ways, basically.
I guess. So
I only want to study the little ones.
And that's about all I have for Freud. I'm sure we could talk all day about Freud, but then the stuff that we're really into is Jungian psychology. And before it gets too far away from us, the reason I think it gets a bad rap today is because it is associated with mysticism, and it also gets associated by extension to some degree with old mores of gender norms and what some would say patriarchal ideas of male and female. And that's something I
like that it's a stereotype, right? It's kind of like a hot topic for people.
Right. And I appreciate those perspectives. And I also want to defend the integrity of myths and archetypes also at the same time. So I would like to discuss that, and find the needle in the haystack if we can.
And something interesting about that is I did, before I got into a lot of this stuff and studying everything in occultism, I had a problem with that too. Like, I thought it was sexist to think that like all men were a certain way or all women. But when you study magic, you understand like a feminine principle and a masculine principle is an idea. It's an ideal. It's not something that you can like look at in reality. So every human being is a mixture of those ideals. It's not to say that like, oh, you're a fucking freak if you don't act like that. You're not a male. It's like that. That's not what these stereotypes are trying to say. It's just it's a pattern. It's an emergent pattern.
Absolutely. I don't really have much to add to that, except like the guy who was presenting the data to me in one of the videos, he was like, oh yeah, as if all women are moody and emotional and irrational.
And he like rolled his eyes.
I
just wanted to hold like an iced pumpkin spice latte up to his face.
He's got viewers. He's got to explain himself too, right? He's into this stuff.
I know. He's got to be like, I don't really think that, you guys. That's silly.
Yeah.
But it's just like, of course it's silly. No one said it was fucking the rule, okay?
But here's the other thing. What's funny about that is, as a friggin' esoteric feminist who's all into Sophia, that's assuming right off the bat that being moody and irrational and illogical is a bad thing.
Yeah, sometimes it's a good
Sometimes it's
buffer.
a good thing. It's a good thing.
Right.
So it's like, so if we're going to just classify these abstract principles as male or female, I don't think it has anything to do with actual gender or how you identify. And that's the thing is like, me personally, you can identify as refrigerator. Go for it. I don't mind. That's all I gotta say. So anyway, I like the building blocks that Jungian archetypes give us to work with. And those building blocks are something that help us rethink things like gender and help us rethink our relationship to everything and I'll get to that because I think Robert Anton Wilson couched a lot of this information better than any of these people, but that's just me. So, but to get too far into the weeds, Jungian psychology, his idea of the ego seems a bit more sophisticated to me.
One thing I do like about Jungian psychology is he does take account to the mythologies and also theosophy. Like, he actually tries to apply a cultural filter when he was dealing with his patients. And he did work under Sigmund Freud and was his student for a long time, but eventually he broke off and started his own practice. And a lot of times he would give therapy to people for free just to get something to study or to make sure that they had what he called transference and that they could heal and move on from the relationship that he provided them. So he still worked within the Freudian framework, but at the same time, he also looked into, say, I would guess you would call it the cultural disposition of each of his patients. So he would apply that on top of the current, I guess, tools of psychoanalysis.
Can you maybe expound on what that means? Like,
he would take into account cultural factors of his patients. So like their religion or like their beliefs.
Got it.
Or vision. Like they both did dream analysis, but Jung found that he could relate it to religions, mythologies, even magical practices or pagan gods. So he went way more into human mythology than Freud tried to cut it out of the psychoanalysis, in other words.
Well, Jung, when he lost his mind, he recorded his works and then he edited them into Liber Novus, the Red Book, or the New Book. It would be known as the Red Book. That's the one we talk about. That's in Dr. Ullman's office in The Shining. And In the Red Book, he almost speaks from a religious perspective. He talks about the precession of the equinoxes. That's the first image in the Red Book, is a giant D, and you can see the sun moving through the signs of the zodiac. And he actually has a lot of assumptions and ideas that feel very much in alignment with Thelema.
They might be, inspired by a higher source, if you will.
That's what it seemed like.
He must have been channeling in his old years.
And if you subscribe to the idea that information comes from heaven or from the stars, or that, if you're a New Ager and you believe just downloads happen, that, there can be envoys of higher consciousness that come to upgrade our consciousness and give new phases of evolution. It seems like around right before World War I is when there was a big wave of that. And historians, I think, will tell you that even before that, like the 100 years preceding World War I, it was a big industrial advancement in every field. And things changed very rapidly with industrialization and standardization and mechanization. And
right.
It was like the steampunk times.
Maybe a little bit after that. So what's next?
Where are we going with that? So anyway, so his idea of the ego is, he simplified it as basically the center of your experience, the things that you're aware of, because to be aware of something, it has to be symbolized to itself. It has to be reflected unto itself. So if you are aware of it, then that's your ego. And anything you're not aware of is your undiscovered self. The first step is like the subconscious, and then the step underneath that would be like the collective unconscious. And so he viewed the ego as you are an individuated consciousness up at the top, and then your roots reach down into a system that connects to every other ego somewhere. And there's this collective symbol system that everyone inherently taps into.
Correct. I was thinking that the super subconscious was above the ego.
I don't know if I have the entire structure here. I just sort of have the gist of it in my mind.
Okay. Let me look at some of this, because your subconscious is below you. Yeah, I know that.
It gets really Kabbalistic and Egyptian at some point, because he talks about how each character in, say, a myth, right? Because Joseph Campbell took a lot from CG Jung.
Mm-hmm.
And each archetype or character in the story is a representation of a different part of the psyche or soul.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to learn to become conscious of them, right? So meet the symbol of them and come to awareness of where that part exists inside of you.
And accept it and integrate it within yourself as a self, a full self.
That's the general idea behind.
Right. And he called that process individuation. So he says in this book, The Undiscovered Self, where he discusses this process, I guess it's becoming an individual self rather than just an ego. He says the structure and physiology of the brain furnish no explanation of the psychic process. The psyche holds within itself the phenomenon of consciousness. Without consciousness, practically speaking, there would be no world, for the world exists as such only insofar as it is consciously reflected and consciously expressed by a psyche. So, in other words, consciousness is you reflecting the world back at yourself. So, consciousness, he says, is a precondition of being. So, you cannot have an ego, you cannot have an I without first being conscious. He liked to explore that a lot. And then the unconscious would be things that your senses intake that you're not necessarily consciously aware of, but your unconscious brain records them.
And so that was the idea behind having the Red Book on the desk in Dr. Ullman's office, because Stanley Kubrick is saying, I'm going to throw symbols and signs and stuff at you that you cannot consciously process. And it would take you 1 million viewings to get it all. And it's your subconscious mind or your unconscious will take in that data and process it in the language of dreams and influence you on some level.
Right.
The way advertisements do.
Right. And he does note the ego itself is formed by consciousness. It's not the other way around.
Oh, say that again?
The ego is shaped by consciousness. It's not the other way around.
Okay.
So your consciousness isn't shaped by who you are. Like your concept of ego, your concept of self is shaped by observing yourself, the act of observing yourself. Because like something that he talked about sometimes was if somebody observes you and talks about your personality, what they're leaving out is like your internal dialogue. Like they're leaving out your psyche entirely. So your ego is it's not a static concept. It's constantly changing. It's almost like an illusion. In other words, it's just a collection of like a collection of traits of your personality or some
Ideas about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Whether be it from you or another person who's observing you.
So the idea then to become a whole person would be to come to consciousness of all the different aspects of your personality and then have them come into a collective whole, and that's what we call individuation.
Correct.
I feel I'm restating that because it sounds so much like the Tarot's journey.
Well, it's probably super similar for a reason.
I mean, he studied the tarot.
Yeah, you can tell. I mean, he does a lot of dream interpretation as well. So, and tarots are symbols in that alphabet.
You could say the Fool is that consciousness. He leaps into the abyss happy, unknowing what's going to befall him because he hasn't reflected on anything at all yet. So in the Joker, this is the moment when the Joker says, I didn't even know that I existed. And that's a lot like what we're talking about, how you need to have some kind of self-reflection in order to even have an ego, to even be considered aware, right? But you still have consciousness.
Right, but you have to be you have to be divided from the world around you. In other words, you have to make the observation that you are you and that the tree in front of you is a tree and it's not you. So babies don't have that for a little while.
Like they reach up and try and grab the moon.
Right. And they can't tell distance, depth, any of that. So you have to develop that over time. And that it takes experience of being an ego. Some of these scientists and Jung also argued that you needed recordings of experiences that you've already had as reference to reinforce your ego structure. So someone with like no memory would really have a weak concept of ego, or with memory issues.
So stoners?
Well, that, or people with Alzheimer's, or people with amnesia. I don't know if you saw that Jim Carrey movie, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Oh, that's
somebody
a good one.
that like woke up every day with no memories of what happened before. Like they don't know who they are every day. So your ego is reinforced in memories, experiences, as well as all your senses at once.
But don't they running this machine to forget each other, and then no matter what, they just run back into each other because that's the power of love?
Right. Yeah, it's something like that. Some fairy tale.
So when the Joker says, I didn't even know I existed yet, it's after he defends himself from those two people or three people and kills them, right? And he becomes the magician. He takes on the fake flowers, and then he goes and harasses Wayne Manor. And at that point, he's at the magician point in his journey. So the magician in the tarot has the wand, the cup, the pentacle, and the dagger on the table, and those represent the four components of his psyche, and they're in front of him, and now he knows he's reflected upon each of those symbols, and now he's unpacked his bag that he had when he was a fool. He knows what's inside, and from that point he can now work. He has some integrity, and that's the Hebrew letter associated with the magician is bet. And it means house. It represents something that has integrity, something you can store things in, something that has shelter, something that has value that you can take to the bank, so to speak, maybe. And so I think that's a lot like the process of individuation. It makes sense in a Jungian sense, you could say.
Yeah, because you talked about the different parts too. And just to review, he considered someone who is completely assimilated as a whole being, as that would be a self. And so your self is comprised of your unconscious or your subconscious, as he called it, your ego, your shadow self, which is you, basically your evil twin is probably the easiest description for that one.
And in
all
most
of your
movies,
negative qualities in one person.
And isn't the antagonist in most films the protagonist if he just let his darker qualities just go and not keep them in check?
Correct. And that oftentimes will reinforce your main ego because it shows you all what you're not. And that's why it's a pretty good plot device to drive a hero in a story, because it's a good contrast. Ego is all about contrast from the outside world. Me versus you, us versus them, that kind of idea.
So it's almost mechanical how Snoke is like, well, as you rise in the dark, there will be one to meet you in the light. Like, it's like inherent in the system, you know, which makes some sense because, you know, as you approach the source of light, your shadow grows taller. Were you going to say something about that?
What about the shadow changing?
Yeah.
Or that it's basically a mirror image. It's an illusion. It's the antagonist to your protagonist. So it's everything that you aren't, you know, all of your negative qualities and none of your positive qualities.
But maybe all of the things you don't want to know about yourself.
And that's part of the process, is you must confront your shadow. That's something that Jung criticized Freud for. This is with all of the psychosexual theory, a lot of people were very afraid with what they had repressed or what it meant or what the symbols meant in their dreams, of what kind of sick things that they had like blocked out of their more positive ego personality. Jung argued that looking at it in that way and not embracing it and integrating it into your own psyche is a harmful approach. So that's one thing that he disagreed with Freud, is that he said that it's not a good device to actually deal with the traumas that you actually carry in your psyche. So he would argue that you confront your shadow, you see all of the negative qualities in it, and instead of being afraid of it and attempting to label it as something else, like a trauma or something that happened to you out of your circumstance, that you must accept it as part of your own psyche to move forward as a whole person.
Otherwise, you're still just a fool.
Correct. You're deluding yourself. And it's more, he thought that Freud's theory is more, and psychoanalysis offered more of abstraction. Like, I saw one of his quotes, and they used to refer to transference as being when a patient was finally over the trauma and they've made other friends and been able to come out with their family, and they can talk to other people again, and they're more socially normal and they seem healed. So that's what transference means. One of his colleagues joked that the transference stops when the patient runs out of money. So this is another reason that he had a problem with the mainstream psychoanalysis, because it was just established. They didn't know what they were doing, but they wanted it to continue on endlessly because of that. You know, that's a good factor to make money all the time. But Jung was often treating people even past the time that they ran out of money. He would continue to treat them just for the experience and the research.
I remember as Jung took part in the big download, if you could believe it's such a thing, that happened prior to World War I, and he collected his works into the Red Book, Liber Novus, and as he aspired to publish them, Freud told him no, it'll unleash a black flood of occultism. And
I have that.
Yeah, and he effectively scared Jung into not releasing it. And then it just would only circulate in certain circles where presumably Kubrick had it. And it was sort of like, another weird, lost, almost a religious text. I almost want to say Gnostic gospel, but I don't know if I'm justified in saying that. He has some very traditional views in terms of like fairy tale imagery. And well, he's European, so he in Liber Novus, it's all fairy tale stuff like knights and kings and princesses and all that stuff.
Mythologies, and they're all human stories. But yeah, that's interesting you bring that up, because part of the reason that he didn't agree with them, the mainstream as well, is because they were trying to, like you said, Freud was afraid of the black flood of occultism.
Well, here it is.
It's yes, but part of the stories of mythology and religion and spiritual practice is that's part of the human psyche. So that's what Jung also believed in, that, you know, a social structure, like a social psyche of a group, would be the same thing as an individual, but on a larger scale. So that's what the archetypes are. And that's why he does study gods, and, you know, he embraced occultism while the others wouldn't. So I think that's a really important distinction between both of them, because otherwise they're pretty similar in their approaches.
Now, can we say that it's because Jung studied so many wisdom traditions and he wasn't afraid of going into those ideas himself?
Yes, that, but you have to have a pretty adept mind, not only to research every little bit of theology and every kind of human culture you can come across. But I think Jung saw patterns that other people didn't see, and that he interpreted the symbols as, he was open to seeing the link between all of those and the similarities versus it being fear mongering about occultism or getting paganism into the science of psychology. That's what they were worried about, is their self-image. They didn't want to appear like some kind of cult, so they wanted to detach themselves from that, and Jung disagreed with that.
Fear of the dark.
Yeah.
Fear of the dark.
Basically. So were they afraid of having the archetypes be used to postmodernize the source of the archetypes? Because, I mean, that's what J.B. Peterson is all worried about. And a lot of people accuse him of having fascist mysticism or patriarchal ideas because he subscribes to the idea of gender norms and gets really into archetypes, and that they're hardwired into our psyche. And it sort of ends there, where on this show, I subscribe to the notion that these archetypes issue from an older source. And the main problem where they get us is they tell us that unity is an end and not a means. And so I know that seems like a subtle point, but it definitely, I don't believe I don't really know if individuation is possible, because you're always growing, right? You're always you're always learning more. Your dreams aren't going to stop. You're not going to stop running into stress. Life goes on. You're going to get older. You're going to have health problems. Your kids are going to yell at you. You're going to yell at your kids. Something bad's going to happen. So that process never really stops. And so,
No, it doesn't.
And so the path to divinity then is union, right? Not unity, but union between yourself and others, which is more like what Alan Watts says. He subscribes to the idea that the ego is an imaginary thing, and that it's something that he calls it like a feature of the universe.
Right, it's a feature of consciousness.
Which is something that is of a collective nature this sounds a lot like Jung, where it all connects through a root system like the collective unconscious, but I don't think Alan Watts used that exact terminology.
No, he was based more in the Eastern traditions, and Jung had a sampling of that, but he used different language to talk about these kind of things. Like, for example, the individuation process, you can get to the point where you're a complete individual, but Jung also talks about it on a different level, where he says that any disorganized system needs a directing principle. So the ego consciousness, not you, the ego, but the type of consciousness that's the ego identified would be the guiding principle. So say if you have a bunch of roads and a bunch of cars, how do we have a guiding principle so that everyone obeys the traffic laws? That way no one wrecks into each other and we know what we're doing. That is the ego consciousness of traffic, is having laws and lights and stuff like that. So it goes into different systems. He goes outward from the individual and extrapolates this theory onto social systems of organization as well. But one thing he does note is he says that in order for a society collectively to be healthy, positive, and grow in a good way, is that as many of the individual members of that society have to be individuated themselves to be a good, basically functioning society as a whole. So ego serves on a sociological basis as well as individual basis in Jung's theory.
So in Jung's theory, if one person evolves, everyone evolves.
The more individuals that do elevate, it creates a higher organizational process within the sociological system, which is driven. It's like a super ego. That's what he's talking about when he talks about the super consciousness or the super unconscious or whatever. Right. It's the psyche of the entire group system of human beings as a whole total. So his theory can be applied to many different levels in the macrocosm or the microcosm.
So that means that evolution on a societal level is linked to evolution on the individual level. And if enough people level up, society levels up, basically?
Exactly. It's kind of like it's like you have a balancing scale and you put one grain of sand on one side, waiting for it to be heavier. And eventually it's going to take one grain, but eventually you're going to have the majority on one side and you'll have the basically it'll flip. So that's what he was trying to say, is that in order for our entire species to thrive, each individual must be taught these things and must be individuated.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. That's a very like comforting notion in some way. I don't know if
Yeah,
it's true.
'cause
It
he
feels-
dealt-
I mean, it seems true, doesn't it? If more people are evolved, they'll have a better chance of communicating efficiently or effectively, right? And being able to create a more complex system that can be benefited from externally by themselves and others, right?
Yes, exactly. And
Doing
that's a
business,
lot of the
doing
reason I really
business.
that's the reason I really prefer his system, is because it can be applied to many other dynamic systems, because it's a very rudimentary, basic outlook on how to progress as either an individual or a social group.
Now,
But he does go into sociology a lot in some of his writings. So he only talks about the ego a couple more times, but he does have an essay about it as well.
this isn't a whole episode on Robert Anton Wilson or Prometheus Rising, which I believe deserves its own episode. And we're nearing the end of the free show, and we've more or less discussed almost everything we'd like to. I think we'd like to move on to Hinduism and some more esoteric ideas and probably relate it to Kabbalah for the more like, you know, magical nerdy folk in the second hour. But just in terms of the classical notions of the ego, I'd like to address how Robert Anton Wilson addresses these things, each of these stages and steps, because they made more sense to me. As I was in school, I was learning and taking classes in psychology, and the further up I got, the more incomprehensible and bizarre it all like just seemed. And I thought it would all gel together. I thought, oh, we've been working with these things for decades, and now there has to be some smart, modernized way of looking at them. And no, it just all sort of splinters off in these weird directions, and then it's like, oh,
Giant feedback loop.
yeah, it gets really weird, and it's hard to make any sense of anything at some point. I decided that I hadn't read anything or seen anything that sounded as intelligent or useful or meaningful as Prometheus Rising at describing the exact same stuff. And so just to loop back around into our notes and just kind of reassess all the stuff we've already looked at, and where I think Freud makes some sense, because honestly, I agree. Everything is sexual. It's like Alejandro Jodorowsky says, you look at the mandala, all of Maya, all of sense experience, all of everything is just being generated by the union of the divine feminine and masculine, the union of opposites, and it's generating novelty.
Agree. That, to an extent.
So I think there's an esoteric underpinning of Freud's assumption that sex relates to everything. And in that regard, let's jump into how it works, like going through each of them. So like the anal stage, that would be like what Robert Anton Wilson would term the first circuit. And he got his information from Leary, who devised like the personality tests. And
oh, yeah.
He actually got presented his own personality tests when he got checked into prison, and then, of course, because it was his test, he made himself score in such a way that he would get put in the lowest minimal security, and then he broke out, which is pretty great.
Oh, Lord.
So this is based on that system of understanding the mind. So it's used at that time, at least in prison. So now this isn't in my notes, but the first circuit is associated with forward and backwards. Nipple good, poo-poo bad. You really know I want to go towards the good thing and away from the bad thing. It's a very Pac-Man way of looking at the universe, you could say. And then the second circuit is built on top of that one. And that circuit is the anal territorial circuit. So far it sounds a lot like Freud. And the anal territorial circuit is who controls me and who do I control in my immediate environment? And do I go...
It's also
Yeah, do I go over the obstacle or do I go under the obstacle?
also known as the no stage.
Okay, when they learn how to say no.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. So those two, now we can go into a full episode on Prometheus Rising, but for this particular episode, the first four circuits are really the most important because they pertain to what we've been calling the ego. And what you were saying just a moment earlier about how these stages of personal evolution can be extrapolated to a larger social structure of evolution that can grow along with the individual. Robert Anton Wilson makes his case that we've pretty much only fully evolved the first two circuits, the oral and the anal. And
right, in the human development as a species.
And he said that the first one that corresponded to the macro was the church, because they largely were in charge of how you think of life and death, who lives on in the afterlife and who goes to hell and who gets to fuck who, basically. Do we go towards this thing or do we go away from this thing? And am I allowed to do this or not allowed to do this? But that also sounds a little, I don't want to get, maybe I'm not explaining it perfectly, but the Second Circuit was associated with the military. Who owns what? What
Or borders.
and borders, yeah, like deciding,
And maps.
right, which you have to go over or under, right, to get, and who's in charge and who's not.
Diplomacy.
And then he says that the Third Circuit is the computer, is associated with the computer stage. And I when I was in school, I don't remember that third one being called the phallic stage. I remember it being called the computer stage, but he calls it the time binding circuit, which means it's our ability to take the archetypes that are associated with the first two circuits and reorganize them in ways that allow us to interfere basically with the functions of the first two. And while the first two circuits are largely obsessed with finding balance and homeostasis within themselves, the Third Circuit is more driven to attain stability at higher and higher levels of energy. And he relates this to like a heat-seeking rocket or a target, a guided missile. And so he relates this from the micro to the macro as the academic parts of our civilization, because they study religion, they study, borders and history, and then they take those ideas and they create context out of them and allows us to become conscious, right, of those things, and then change our ideas about them. And that essentially only so much change is ever going to happen, because the first two circuits in seeking homeostasis are naturally going to try and restrict the freedom of the Third Circuit. So you're always going to have this uncomfortable relationship between academia and religion and the man, basically, the police and the military. And that changes in these fields could only really happen one generation at a time, because basically after the age of 35, new information starts to become threatening, because evolutionarily speaking, it could mean that there's another way of life that could lead to the extinction of your tribe. And so you move from a stage of taking in information and learning and integrating to like crystallizing it. And so that's why it takes a while for ideas to catch on. And then that brings us to the Fourth Circuit, which is most closely associated with morality and parenting. But it also has to do, like, he brings it up in the context of like someone with a very overdeveloped Fourth Circuit, because in his way of looking at it, you kind of get more robotized on one of these circuits. You get more like trained into a pattern and you rely on one circuit more than another. So the people that rely on their Fourth Circuit the most tend to be like very good looking. They tend to be the ideal sexual partner, like, for some reason. I don't know what that means, but it also has to do with like parenting and morality. And what did you made a very good argument to me while I was going back and scrubbing through the audio, that you felt that this had you see how this is reflected in the macrocosm. And how did you see it?
Because this is the Fourth Circuit, right? So
yeah, the Fourth Circuit.
Third is authoritarian. And
no. Second is the authoritarian anal circuit. The third is the academic one.
Academic. Okay. So the fourth would be, like you said, parental in morality. I would argue that the court system, the judges and a jury and lawyers who interpret the law, and Congress people that write laws, would be interpreted as the parents of society at large. And the police are the authoritarians. So yes, they apprehend you, they put you in the car, take you downtown, but where they ultimately take you is to your parent, which is the judge or the courtroom or the lawyer, what have you. Now,
it gets really deep, because we live in a society that subscribes to the idea of maritime admiralty law. So when you cross those little like barriers, you're basically stepping onto a ship, and then the judge has the same authority that they would have like on a ship. They're like the master and commander, right? It doesn't matter if you're a president or if you're the whatever, you're still just a subject in that person's court or boat or whatever.
You're at their mercy.
Yeah, you're at their mercy, essentially. And so I guess in so much as maybe we can relate that circuit to mercy, that makes some sense because they decide what is just, like what is fair. And I you know what, like what really stands out to me is I remember seeing this one video this one time where a black woman was arrested, like she had gotten drunk or something and she had gotten arrested, and they arrested her and she didn't have any pants and they didn't give her any pants. And she also was like menstruating at the time. And so it seemed very much like the police in their like Second Circuit authoritarian way of dealing with the problem was to like shame her and reduce her to like, you know, that like a childlike state, or at least attempt to. And then when they showed up in court and she was all dirty, the judge is like, why are you showing up this way? And she's like, well, you know, I'm kind of menstruating and they didn't give me any pants. And the judge was like, okay, you cops fucked up so bad. I'm just going to let this person go right now. And you guys are in trouble and you guys are in trouble, you know?
See?
And so that's like,
the cops are like your big brother that like has to go out and get you when you break curfew. But ultimately the judge is dad and he'll whip you with a belt if you did wrong.
Yeah. You know, he's the one that sets the sentence. Like, so.
And punishes. Yeah. He dishes out the punishment.
It's not really the job of the Second Circuit even to dish out the punishment. It's more like them to defend the territory and be like a defender, you know?
Like a reactionary defender,
Yeah, not an aggressor itself. So I guess that's sort of, that's I think that covers the ego pretty well from most of the classical perspectives and sort of weaves them a bit into the mystical. I would like to introduce Thelema now, but I think that's a whole discussion that would probably lead into like Hinduism. So if y'all want to hear about the esoteric perspectives of the ego, which is probably just going to be us rediscussing a lot of our esoteric perspectives, you can find elsewhere in the free show in our older episodes, which you should feel free to scroll through. If you'd like to hear the full episode, go to www.patreon.com/thewholerabbit, where $5 will get you all the dang old full episodes. You'll get stickers that are definitely worth more than $5, and I'll just send it to you and use the money for postage. And like you can unsubscribe after the month is over, and I'm pretty sure you'll still get your sticker. If you don't, send me a message and I'll definitely send it to you. So thank you for listening. The show's ad-free on our other platforms. If you're listening to this on YouTube, I'm getting a lot of complaints because we monetized, and give me a break, man. This is all I do now.
I mean, you got kicked out, so you need the money. But
well, they sold the house. They sold the house.
Yeah.
So
wait, they did?
Yeah, and then I had a really bad encounter with a family member after that, and I'm on the lam. So you're going to hear some shows where I'm like talking into the microphone on the road and visiting like sacred sites, hopefully, and being like, this is the haunted house of the Sedona Rock of the mystical portal or whatever. And I'll be like, yeah, this is rad, bro. Oh, I saw ghosts. And I'll just lie. No, I'm not going to do that.
Interview the ghosts. Get some good interviews, though.
And then if I can't see a ghost, I'll just pretend I'm the ghost. Like, hello, I'm a ghost. And just,
oh my God, you guys.
And if they arrest me, I'll just talk the cop. They'll just use all my privilege to be like, please, cop, let me take the microphone with me. I just need to record this. And he'll be like,
oh my God.
So anyway.
Luke.
Yeah.
Luke, you know what you need to remember when the cop pulls you over? This is the one thing you should always say just to be sure.